All right. So we are kicking off today's event with Weiwen Yin, and Professor Thomas Christensen is back with us again, and he'll be giving the introduction.
Hi, I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is one of our 3 fellows this year. In the China in the World program, we give postdoctoral fellows for people who work on international relations in general and on China in particular, and try to meld those 2 fields of study. Our fellow today is a great example of this. He is Weiwen Yin, who comes to us from Texas A&M University, where he got his Ph.D. He has a master's degree from the University of Tokyo, and he has a BA from Peking University in Beijing. And he also has an MA in political science at the Central European University. So he's truly a global scholar. He combines interest in international political economy with China's foreign relations. He's also a methods whiz, and he's taught methodology at Texas A&M. So he brings a lot of skills to his research. As a graduate student, he was tremendously successful, publishing several papers, including one in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, which is a leading journal in international relations, in the international relations of the Asia Pacific, and in the Japanese Journal of Political Science. His work studies the impact of institutions on issues like foreign direct investment. And today he's going to make a presentation entitled Bundling Institutions, How Institutions Influence the Location of Foreign Direct Investment. And I just say it's a special pleasure because Weiwen is the first of our 3 fellows this year to be presenting in the speaker series. So he's our maverick, and we're proud to have him here. And I'll turn it over to Weiwen.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for introducing me, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Please allow me to share my screen. All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you for coming here, everyone. Today I'm going to present actually 2 papers. One of them is more theoretically focused, and the other is more policy relevant. The second one is directly relevant to the US-China trade war. So if you are interested in this topic, please stay for a longer while. And the first one is actually my job market paper in my dissertation, Boundary Institutions, How Institutions Influence the Location of Foreign Direct Investment. And the second paper is the policy implication of this paper. And so the reason why I start this paper is because I noticed there is a contradiction between theory and facts. Existing theory in IP suggests that rule of law could help countries attract FDI. This is because countries with rule of law, i.e. countries with independent courts, could provide strong property rights protection and contract enforcement. But in reality, we see that FDI is flowing into countries without rule of law. Let me just give you an example. So this is the measure for judicial independence, the so-called latent judicial independence score, where 0 means the country has fully dependent courts and 1 means the country has fully independent courts. The mean of the world is 0.45. United States have very independent courts, so it has a very high score. China, which is the 2nd largest recipient of FDI for many years, has a very low score in this measure. Vietnam, which are labeled as a bright star in Asia, has an even lower score than China. And Egypt, which is the top destination of foreign direct investment in Arab and Africa, has only still a very low judicial independence score, slightly better than China. So my question is, if property rights protection and contract enforcement are so important in attracting FDI, then we have to ask, in these countries without rule of law, what is really providing property rights protection and contract enforcement? And to address this research question, I shed light on 2 sets of international investment institutions. They are bilateral investment treaties, BIT, that provide property rights protection, and transnational commercial arbitration institutions, TCA, that provide contract enforcement. The finding of this paper is that a combination of the 2 can, to some extent, substitute for rule of law, and I use firm level data to test my argument. The contribution of this paper is fourfold. First, it addresses a puzzle of why some countries with dependent and corrupt courts can attract FDI. Second, it helps us to clarify the effects of bilateral investment treaties. So in the IP literature, scholars have been very interested in studying the effects of BITs. Some argue that BITs is useful, some argue that BIT is not useful in attracting FDI, and the finding of this paper might help us understand a little bit why BIT is useful, and it is only useful in certain contexts. Finally, third, I introduced an important omitted variable in the politics of FDI, that is transnational commercial arbitration institutions, which has been neglected by scholars. And finally, I believe the findings would also have implications for us to understand authoritarian regime survival. And I will talk more about that later. So my theory is built on existing literature in institutional economics and political economy. Some scholars have identified that foreign investors may face two kinds of hazards in the host country. Political hazard, the risk that their assets would be expropriated by the host government. And contractual hazard, the risk that the contract they signed with domestic firms would be violated. And scholars also identify that there are two kinds of institutions that address these hazards respectively. That is the so-called property rights institutions that constrain the transgression of the government, and contracting institutions that facilitate contract formation and enforce private contracts. Independent courts is such an institution that could provide both functions. Strong courts could provide property rights and enforce contract, and that is the reason why countries with independent courts are attractive investment destinations. I argue that there are actually institutions, international institutions, that could substitute for both functions of independent courts, and they are bilateral investment treaties and TCA, transnational commercial arbitration institutions. The theoretical argument goes this way. A combination of BIT and TCA could help attract FDI, and a combination of the two has stronger effect in countries without rule of law. So what is BIT? What is TCA? Bilateral investment treaty is an international treaty signed between countries, between governments. The first one was signed between West Germany and Pakistan. And currently there are over 3,000 BITs in force in the world, and this is the geographical distribution. And as you could see, Germany and China signed a lot of BITs. The task of BIT is to resolve investor-state disputes. Specifically, if the investors' assets are expropriated by the host government, they could sue the host government, but not at the domestic court of the host country. Instead, they could sue the host government at the so-called ICSID, International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is an independent tribunal to resolve investor-state disputes. So when countries sign into BITs, it means that they could no longer force investors to settle the disputes in domestic court, which could be corrupt and dependent. Are BITs really important? So there's actually a survey, 2017-2018 World Bank Global Investment Competitive Survey. So they asked 154 executives of multinational companies. And a lot of them say, yes, BITs are important or critically important, and only a very small percentage, less than 50% of the people will say BITs are not important at all. But investor-state disputes is only one of the two kinds of disputes that investors may face in the host country. The other kind of disputes would be the disputes between foreign and domestic firms, and we call them contractual disputes. They are called contractual disputes in the literature. Say, for example, the disputes between this fake Air Jordan in China and the real Air Jordan in China are such a kind of disputes. So it has nothing to do with the government. I mean, it's not investor-state dispute. It is disputes between foreign and domestic firms, and they look so similar. And why we have contractual disputes? Because contracts are necessarily incomplete. When we sign into a contract, it's almost impossible for us to foresee all possible future contingencies. Examples include asset specificity, technological leakage, and free riding on brand reputation. While this is something that's pretty understudied, it actually occurs very, very frequently in the real world. Say, for example, ICSID, which is the tribunal that handles investor-state disputes, at most 1 year, it registers 53 new cases at most. But of course, most of them are very important cases. The legal fee could be like tens of millions of dollars, but at most only 53. But in ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the many transnational commercial arbitration institutions in the world to resolve contractual disputes, at most in 1 year, it could register 900 cases. And this is only one of the many. So contractual disputes are very likely to occur. And like BITs, contractual disputes could be resolved not in domestic court, but in so-called TCA, transnational commercial arbitration institutions. So what is TCA? So when I introduce this, I always have to refer, I always have to talk about early TCAs in medieval Europe, merchant guilds and private courts, and Paul Milgram, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics today or yesterday, actually also contribute to the study of merchant guilds and private courts. He mainly studies auction, but like his work is also, he also studies merchant guilds and private courts, and they are the earliest TCA institutions in the world. In medieval Europe, the first generalized TCA actually appeared in Low countries, today's Belgium and Netherlands, in the 16th century. They are generalized because they are accessible to all merchants, regardless of their profession and country of origin. The task is to resolve disputes between private actors from different countries. Representative TCA institutions include ICC, International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, American Arbitration Association, AAA, and CTEC, China International Economic Trade Arbitration Commission. So I would like to talk a little bit more about CTEC. So this is the number, this is TCA institutions in the world. Again, you could see that many countries have both leading and regional TCA institutions. All right, so CTEC is a very, very interesting case because legal scholars who are studying commercial arbitration have to study CTEC. CTEC is founded by this guy whose name is Ji Chaoding. He was actually a spy of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s. And he had 2 PhD, one PhD in economics in Columbia University, and the other is PhD in law in University of Chicago in 1930s. So he first went to Chicago and then he came to Columbia and get his PhD. And this is his PhD dissertation, which is still widely read if you are interested in studying Chinese economic history, in particular agricultural history. So it is still like, this is the reprint, but like it was actually first written in the 1930s. But he was actually a spy of the Chinese Communist Party. And when he returned to China, he was working in the Central Bank of ROC, Republic of China, and contribute to the super inflation, creating the hyperinflation that destroyed the ROC economy. And no one knows his true identity until in his funeral that Zhou Enlai himself showed up and actually hosted his funeral. So he's a very, very important guy in the economic domain of the Chinese Communist Party. And he is the one who created this CTEC, advocated to create. And the reason why CTEC has been a focus is because CTEC was not very professional in the 1990s. So CTEC is almost one of the, is almost the only one arbitration institutions that release a lot of arbitral awards. Basically, you could know the details of the disputants, right? I mean, but in other arbitration institutions, these arbitrations are usually conducted in secrecy, but not in CTEC. So CTEC was not very professional. It released a lot of arbitral awards, which could allow legal scholars to study the operation of arbitration institutions. And in another paper of mine, I studied why CTEC could be helpful for the governments to attract FDI, in particular to help local governments in China to attract FDI. This is because CTEC is a credible signal. It is signal sent by the local governments because local agencies of CTEC were all established in response to the petition of local governments. So it is not established by the headquarters, it's not established by the central governments. And it has the so-called hand-tying effect. It is highly independent, physically and administratively. So unlike Chinese domestic courts, basically the governments cannot intervene. And it is highly internationalized. We could not imagine that in Chinese courts, there will be foreign judges, but in CTEC and other similar arbitration institutions, there are foreign arbitrators. And in fact, in this Hainan International Arbitration Court, which was recently built and which is part of the Chinese government's reform to open Hainan, in these 2 years, they actually require at least 1/3 of the foreign arbitrators must hold a foreign passport. So this is basically something we could not imagine in Chinese courts, but like there is this kind of aspiration for internationalization, and foreign languages could be used in the arbitration process, and this is also not possible either in Chinese courts. So this graph summarizes my theory. Foreign investors will face 2 kinds of hazard: political hazard, the risk that their assets will be expropriated by the government, and contractual hazard, that they will have disputes with local firms. Political hazards give rise to the so-called investor-state disputes, while contractual hazard is responsible for the disputes between private actors. And BIT could help to resolve investor-state disputes, and this part of the graph have been widely studied in IPE. So at least there are 50 papers about the effect of BITs already, as far as I know. But this is under study. How TCA institutions resolve disputes between private actors are under study. And therefore, for a country, if it has signed many BITs, and if it has established a reputational TCA institutions, then these countries could be attractive FDI destinations, even it has no independent courts. So this is my argument. A combination of the 2 could help attract FDI, and a combination of the 2 would have a stronger effect in countries without rule of law, because they are basically substituting for 2 functions of the court. So I will have a hypothesis that concerns about the effects of TCA and BIT respectively. So in hypothesis 1, I argue that TCA could help attract FDI when the other BIT is present, and decreases in the level of judicial independence. And I have a parallel assumption about the effect of BIT. So BIT could help attract FDI when the other is present, but the effect would be stronger in countries without rule of law and weaker in countries with independent courts. So I would not talk too much about the statistical analysis. I'm basically using firm level data. The unit of analysis is parent company, potential host country. Dependent variable is whether the parent company established a foreign subsidiary, and key independent variables include BIT, TCA, and independent score. And I will skip a lot of the statistical analysis, and I will only focus on the key finding. So if you look at this figure, this is the marginal effect, the effect of BIT on the establishment of subsidiaries. So as you could tell, the effect of BIT is positive and strongest in countries with a lowest level of LJI, lowest level of judicial independence. And the effect would decreases when the country's level of judicial independence increases. And without TCA institutions, however, the effect of BIT is negligible substantively. This is because BIT could only address one of the 2 kinds of hazards. The other kind of hazard, contractual disputes, cannot be addressed in countries without rule of law and without TCA. So again, BIT is useful only when TCA is also present, and it will become less useful when TCA is absent. Similarly, this graph shows you the average marginal effect of TCA. So again, the effect of TCA is positive and significant when BIT is present, when the other one is present, and it decreases as the level of judicial independence increases, because countries with good rule of law doesn't need BIT or TCA. Finally, without BIT, the blue line suggests that actually TCA is not useful either, because TCA could only address one kind of dispute, contractual dispute, while the other kind, political hazard, cannot be addressed by institutional arrangements if there is no BIT. So this is a summary of my finding, and I will skip a lot of empirical analysis and only talk about what are those countries that are really using a combination of BIT and TCA. So as you could tell, these are the countries with many BITs, actually more BITs than United States, somewhat or very close, TCA institutions, and have a very low level of judicial independence. We could see that a lot of them are located in Middle East. And in fact, for legal scholars who are studying commercial arbitration institutions, they actually have already been doing field research on how those authoritarian regimes in Middle East are actually very passionate in promoting commercial arbitration and signing BITs. So this is something that not only supported by my statistical analysis. Actually, before I run these regressions, there are already existing literature in particular in legal sociology, and the scholars are actually finding out that actually Middle East countries are very, very interested in doing so. In addition, we find China suddenly, Singapore as well. Singapore has become a hub of regional arbitration, a regional hub of commercial arbitration, and UAE has established very high standard commercial arbitration institutions as well. And finally, Vietnam, they have become a more and more popular investment destinations. So this is not only reviewed and supported by my statistical analysis. Actually, legal scholars have been doing field research and providing anecdotal evidence. So this is my my first paper. The take-home message is that a combination of these two kinds of institutions can, to some extent, substitute for rule of law, and it adjusts us the puzzle, and it helps us to understand why some countries with dependent and corrupt courts could attract FDI. And talking back, the implication on authoritarian regime survival, actually, many legals are that these regimes could continue to use their politically illiberal courts to abuse human rights and strengthen their rule, but could use these so-called liberal economic courts to attract foreign capital. So it's actually something that authoritarian leaders like it. We could tell that from anecdotal evidence, like in Libya and Egypt before the revolutions. Actually, the authoritarian regimes are very energetic in promoting BITs and TCA. And this is because they find that they don't have to reform domestic courts, which could be time-consuming and detrimental to their rule, authoritarian rule. Instead, they could use these independent courts, these liberal institutions, to attract capital. So this is a kind of like partial rule of law argument. They try to have rule of law in the economic domain, but in the political domain, they will still continue. They will still prefer to have the established domestic courts. So this would basically the conclusion of my first paper, and please allow me to talk about the second paper that is directly relevant to the first. And I would, Daniel, is there any questions for me now?
There are no questions yet. Just a reminder to everybody viewing that if you have questions, please submit them in the chat box, and we'll review as many of them as we can.
Weiwen, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Before you go to the next section.
Yes.
Singapore is considered a real rule of law place with developed independent courts. So I was surprised to see it on the list that you have there of kind of a list of illiberal regimes that clearly require this kind of arbitration. So that's my first question. And yeah. My second question is about arbitration in general, and how important it is, not just as a replacement for an illiberal court system, but as a replacement for an expensive liberal court system. And the reason I ask is my father, who never went to college, was in the construction industry in New York. He was an arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association because people trusted him. So he didn't have any legal education, even a college education, but he would be brought to places like Texas or Puerto Rico, and businesses who had problems with each other would present their case to these arbitration boards, and they were binding. And he always explained it to me as this was a way to stay out of the courts and save a lot of money, and just have several honest people make a decision that might take 2 or 3 years in the courts. Have you found evidence that that's the case?
Thanks a lot. Very great. Let me briefly address the first. Yeah, I was so astonished to see Singapore listed here. So using an alternative measure like the World Bank Rule of Law indicator, Singapore is a country with high level of rule of law. But according to these authors who measure level of judicial independence, de facto level of judicial independence, they will see Singapore as like the country without truly independent courts. So I think this is a little bit like debatable, but removing Singapore in the analysis would not change the key finding here. So yeah, I think the main finding remains, and actually that's what I do. I use alternative measures. And but yeah, I think this is a debatable question whether Singapore should be put here. But the fact is, Singapore has become a regional hub of arbitration, commercial arbitration. And actually, there's a so there are basically two important international treaties on commercial arbitration. First is the 1958 New York Convention, and the second is the 2019 Singaporean Mediation Convention. Both of them require countries, signatory countries, to enforce arbitral awards issued by foreign arbitration institutions. So they are very high standard, and they are regarded as the most successful private international law in history. So Singapore has a very good reputation in providing commercial arbitration. That is why the treaty, the Mediation Convention, is named Singapore Mediation Convention. So that's and the second is that I'm very glad that finally I could talk to someone who know about AAA. I talked to people who know about CTEC, who has been working in CTEC, but I didn't know people. I don't have the connection. So probably
I don't know much. I was a kid. I was a kid and he was doing it. I don't know much. He just explained why he was going to Puerto Rico and Texas as an arbitrator and what it meant. So
right, yeah, definitely. So Madagascar, an African country, is also building commercial arbitration, and the reason why it built it is because people realize that if we go through domestic courts, which may not be corrupt, may not be dependent, but if we go through that, at least it will take 2 years at the very least. But if we go for commercial arbitration in the same country, it's very likely that the dispute will be settled in 2 or 3 months. And actually, this is the principle for all commercial arbitration institutions. They want to resolve the disputes as soon as possible. Of course, as fairly as possible and as soon as possible. So basically, the losing side cannot appeal to the arbitral awards. So they could not appeal. They have to accept it. And indeed, they do comply. And this is one of the very important incentives of why countries are promoting commercial arbitrations, because it is fair and cheap and professional. The arbitrators themselves, they may not have legal degrees, and actually a lot of them don't, but they know this area, they know this profession so well that even judges cannot compete with them in the arbitration processes. So that is the reason why they are very, in fact, let me tell you this, CTEC handled 2,000 cases per year, but 75% of them involve no foreign parties. So even 2 Chinese firms would have the incentive to settle the disputes not in Chinese courts, but in CTEC. They were established, they were intended, they were built to basically provide arbitration services to foreign firms. But no, eventually even Chinese firms are actually using these kind of institutions. And in fact, there's a survey asking them why they prefer CTEC over the domestic courts. And a lot of them actually, first, they are fair, and the second most important factor is that they are cheap. Okay. And CTEC is really, even compared to the international counterparts in other countries, their price is really pretty low. Yeah. So okay. I'm very glad that you bring this. This is not something that I explain too much in the paper because not many people know this, and I'm very glad that I didn't expect that you actually are quite familiar with this area. And this is something that I talked about in one of the case study on China, but not in this general paper.
Okay, thanks a lot. That was a great beginning, so I don't want to keep you from the second part of your talk.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. This is a great question. So please allow me to continue my talk. This is a paper, a working paper of me with my co-author, who is also my committee member, Tim Betts, and he's now based in Germany. So this is the title: Institutional Comparative Advantage and the Distributional Effects of International Trade. And this paper is more policy relevant. So in this paper, we study anti-globalization sentiments in industrialized democracy. Because existing IP literature indicate that industrialized democracies tend to support free trade, but we are now seeing a rise of anti-globalization sentiments in these countries. Why? Why this is the case? So we provide a theory of institutional comparative advantage linking international institutional environment and domestic politics. And our finding is actually could help us to understand the rise of Donald Trump in the 2016 US presidential election. there are many scholars in IPU who study the redistributive and political consequences of free trade, and they attribute the political consequences of free trade to differences in factor endowments, productivity, occupation, etc., etc. So there's a huge body of literature on this. But the problem for this literature is that they tend to view firms isolated. So this firm-based approach, in their views, firms and industries are basically isolated with each other. But in reality, firms and industries are intertwined in a very complicated production network. Say, for example, the production of Industry 1 may rely on the inputs from other industries. And this is this tells you the number of supplying industries for selected industries. And as you could tell, the iron and steel industries require a lot of inputs from other industries, but not necessarily true for many agricultural products, agricultural sectors. So why this is relevant with the first paper? It sounds like it's completely new, but actually it is highly relevant. Please allow me to introduce you the concept of contract intensity, which is relevant with contract enforcement. But before I do that, I have to introduce another concept, the so-called relationship specificity. So inputs, there are different kinds of inputs. Some inputs can be bought in the open market, so they are openly exchanged. And some inputs are so-called reference priced, and still it is very easy for the buyer to find alternatives because they are openly exchanged. But some inputs are not, and they are neither openly exchanged nor reference price, meaning that it is produced by a firm, sold to a specific firm, so the buyer can hardly find alternatives. And this is the so-called relationship-specific inputs. They are specific to this relationship between the seller and the buyer. And to produce this relationship-specific input, we need to have the so-called relationship-specific investment. And relationship-specific investment could only, they demand strong contract enforcement. This is because it is very difficult for the buyers to find alternatives of such inputs. If the producer fails to produce the promised quantity and quality, the buyers will suffer losses because it's very difficult, almost impossible to find alternatives. Therefore, strong contract enforcement is necessary to deter the producer from violating contractual obligations. They must produce at the promised quantity and quality. So strong contract enforcement is needed. And countries with strong contract enforcement are very good at producing these contract-intensive goods that demand a lot of relationship-specific investment. So goods that demand a lot of relationship-specific investment inputs are called contract-intensive goods. And countries that are good at doing so are said to have the so-called institutional comparative advantage. So good institutions can be a source of comparative advantage, and this is how it could be. Because countries with good institutions, i.e. good, strong contract enforcement, are good at producing these so-called contract-intensive goods that demand a lot of relationship-specific inputs and relationship-specific investments. And if you think contract-intensive goods are kind of difficult to understand, you could just replace contract-intensive with complex. Goods that are very, very complex are regarded as contract-intensive. And a very prominent economist in Harvard has been studying this topic for many years. He constructed an industrial level contract intensity. Basically, it's just like, so R is just the level of input that is relationship specific, and theta is just the weight that is basically the value of the input divided by the total value in the industry. So this basically is just the ratio of the input. So basically, just like it's a weighted average of the relationship specific level. So the z-score tells you how much the industry rely on relationship specific inputs, and that's the instinct. So this figure presents you contract intensity for selected industries. So while iron and steel requires a lot of inputs from others, they actually have a very low level of contract intensity because the buyers can easily find alternatives. it is not very difficult for them to find alternatives. It's very easy for them to buy iron and steel from other countries or from other sectors, from other firms. On the other hand, some agricultural sectors are actually quite contract intensive because they require a lot of relationship-specific inputs, meaning that the buyers, the producers in the downstream, it's very difficult for them to find alternatives for the inputs. So countries that have good institutions are said to have the so-called institutional comparative advantage, meaning that they are very good at producing contract intensity. But the problem is that for many industrialized democracies, such institutional comparative advantage is actually in erosion. This is because property rights protection and contract enforcement are steadily increasing in the world. So the median level of property rights protection in the world are increasing since the 1960s, and the standard deviation are decreasing, meaning that there is indeed an institutional convergence in our international institutional environment. So countries are becoming better and better at providing property rights protection and contract enforcement in general. And as you could tell, the United States is becoming less and less competitive in producing contract intensive goods. So this is basically the contract intensity level of US exports weighted by the exports, by the industry's exports over the total exports. So basically you could tell that the United States is becoming less and less competitive in producing these complex goods or contract intensive goods. Why this is the case? Democratization, third way, which helped many countries to build independent courts. Competition for global capital, which incentivize countries, developing countries, to adopt policy reforms and institutional reforms that are friendly towards property rights protection and contract enforcement. International treaties like BIT, and finally, arbitration institutions that I have been explaining in the first paper. So for many developing countries, they may have no time or no incentive to build a very clean and strong courts, independent courts, but it is relatively easy for them to use international institutions such as BIT and TCA to improve contract enforcement and property rights protection in a relatively short time. And this would have redistributive consequences. We have welfare consequences. That is, we expect that vote share for anti-globalization candidate and specifically Donald Trump would be higher in counties, in US counties that historically rely on contract intensive industry, and then later witness a large decline in such industries. So we're basically arguing that in places in United States, counties that are historically good at producing contract intensive goods, and then later witness a significant decline, would be likely to vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election, and not other Republican candidates, and only Donald Trump. And we will explain why. So how we could construct the county level contract intensity. So the Z-score is the industry level contract intensity. So we are basically calculating the weighted average of the Z-score, where the weights are the population employed in the industry. So say for example, in industry I, there are 1,000 people employed in industry I in the county, and there are 10,000 people total 10,000 total employment in the county. So the lambda would just be 0.1. So we're basically just calculating the weighted average of the industrial level contract intensity, where the weights are basically the employment in different industries. So the X score would be the county level of contract intensity in the United States. And this figure shows you the county level contract intensity. This is different from manufacturing. We all talked about how the shrinkage of U.S. manufacturing sector is contributing to the rise of Donald Trump. This is a slightly relevant but different story. So as you could tell, yeah, indeed, in many metropolitan areas, the counties they rely on contract intensive industry, and this is the county level intensity for 2012. So indeed, in metropolitan areas, they have very high score in contract intensity, but this is also true in many like Midwestern counties, right? I mean, like they might actually be they might actually be rely on contract intensive industries as well. And this is the summary statistics of county-level contract intensity measurement in different years. So as you could tell, the mean of the county-level intensity score of the United States have been decreasing since 1998. In addition to that, the maximum level has always been decreasing as well. So there's evidence that there's quite strong evidence that the United States are becoming less and less competitive in producing these contract intensity goods that require a lot of relationship-specific investments. So we look at U.S. counties. The dependent variable would be Donald Trump's vote share in 2016, and the key independent variable are the historical level of contract intensity and the drop in contract intensity. And we expect that counties that are historically dependent on contract intensity score or in contract intensity industries, and then later witness a significant decline in these industries, are more likely to cast their votes on Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. And indeed, our empirical analysis supports our hypothesis. The 1998 level, the historical level of contract intensity, are indeed positively associated with the vote share of Donald Trump. And the decrease of contract intensity is also positively contributing to the vote share of Donald Trump. And let us be clear, we study Donald Trump because Donald Trump is one of the very few Republican politicians that is explicitly holding an anti-globalization political agenda. So we want to see whether this is something inherent, whether contract intensity is inherent in party politics, or it is more about globalization, anti-globalization sentiments. So we regress the vote share of the 2012 presidential, we regress the vote share of Mitt Romney, who is the Republican candidate in the 2012 presidential election, on this intensity score and the decrease in the intensity score. And we find that this is it has no effect, and this is exactly our theoretical expectation. We expect that the decrease in contract intensity and the historical level of contract intensity has nothing to do with the vote share of Mitt Romney. This is because Mitt Romney has no anti-globalization agenda. So the anti-globalization sentiments. So indeed, this finding shows you that indeed the contract intensity score we construct is actually reflecting anti-globalization sentiments instead of like something inherent in the U.S. party politics. So it has nothing about like inherent support for Republican or Democrat candidate. It's about the support for anti-globalization politicians. And our finding holds when we control for manufacturing in both analysis. So our story is relevant with manufacturing sector. A lot of people attribute Donald Trump's rise to the shrinkage of manufacturing sector. That's true, but our take is slightly different. This is because United States is not only good at manufacturing. Actually, United States is actually good at one specific kind of manufacturing, that is complex goods. But the problem is that United States is losing this kind of institutional competitive advantage. Again, the problem is that it is not because the United States institutions are becoming worse and worse, but it's just because the world is catching up. And the world is catching up partly because of, so these international liberal economic institutions were basically established, were advocated by United States. So these institutions were basically established, advocated by United States to promote globalization. But eventually these institutions are contributing to anti-globalization sentiments currently in the United States that we currently observe in the United States. So this is kind of like ironic, but like this is the take-home message of the finding of our paper is that international institutions are indeed responsible for anti-globalization movements in industrialized democracies, and and this is the major contribution of our paper. And this would conclude my presentation of the two papers. Sorry, I take too much time, I believe. And please feel free to ask me any questions if you have any questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Weiwen. Once again, for everyone joining us as participants, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. In the meantime, Tom, do you have a question you'd like to ask? Give him a second to think about it. Hold on.
So I'm always, Weiwen, it's a great talk. Both talks are great. I feel smarter after listening to you present these two presentations.
Thank you.
And I really like the way they fit together. They do fit together. They the second one comes around at the end to talk about the same institutions that you discuss. And what I'm wondering about in terms of political science theory is, are those areas of the country that have contract-intensive production really worse off because of globalization in terms of their general per capita incomes? Or is it a sense of disappointment, a kind of psychological disappointment that they now have to face competition and they expected more than they got? Are they really hurting, or are they really frustrated, I guess is what I'm saying.
Thanks a lot. So in our paper, we actually provide some anecdotal evidence as well. So indeed, so say for example, am I still sharing my screen? Okay, yeah. So say for example, in many these kind of Midwestern counties, they sometimes have a firm or a factory that is supplying inputs for, like, say for example, Ford or some like automobile manufacturing firms in the United States. But the problem is that they increasingly face competition from abroad, from China, but not necessarily only from China. So then they were so dominant in the local economy that once this factory lose profit or went bankrupt, the people themselves are basically get unemployed. So we actually provide a more statistical analysis to identify the causal mechanism, how the erosion of contract intensity is causing the rise of this kind of anti-globalization sentiments, and the most important mechanism is employment.
But it seems to me that your theory would fit better for an American firm that was selling abroad to another country under a contract-intensive environment, and then was challenged by a third country that was selling to that second country in a contract-intensive environment. The replacement of a U.S. company to a Ford manufacturing line by a Chinese company doesn't really get at what you're talking about, because the U.S. courts are still the institutional arbiter of the contract. What you really need to show is that a country like Ford will go to another country, or the producers for car parts to, say, Sweden from the United States will be competed with from a country, somewhere in Eastern Europe that before didn't have liberal courts, but now has liberal courts and can credibly commit to a special contractual relationship. Does that make sense, my question?
Yeah. And it perfectly makes sense. And I first of all, I can immediately tell that you fully understand what I'm saying in this presentation. It's kind of complex, and you do capture the essence of it. Yeah, you're absolutely correct that this is more about the story of U.S. exports, not about like internal circulation within the United States. Yeah, I think your advice is very helpful for us to revise this paper to highlight that this is more about a story about the decline of U.S. exports in these industries. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, and I was actually worrying that my this presentation, because I have to introduce a lot of new concepts. So I actually, in previous presentations, there are people who don't understand what I'm saying, but it seems.
Oh, no, it's very clear. It was really, really clear. So the other part has a really big political punch that you should emphasize.
Yeah.
Is that these areas that are switching from a pro-globalization to an anti-globalization political position, which is not just Donald Trump, it's also Bernie Sanders. So it's also the left wing of the Democratic Party. Trump is a very unusual Republican on this score, as you said. So they could be switching. The general argument is that the jobs were stolen by China because of cheap labor. And what you're arguing is it's actually the proliferation of legal and basically institutions that Americans consider to be positive, not to countries like China, but to other new democracies around the world that have created the competition for those industries. And that's a very different political story, a different political narrative about the threat of globalization to those places. And it becomes difficult for Americans to say we shouldn't be encouraging countries to have rule of law because it creates difficult competition for our businesses. And that seems to be what you're arguing, which is just, it's mind-blowing if true, and you made a pretty clear argument.
Yeah, so that's I believe that this is something pretty ironic. That is like what United States have been promoting for decades is actually hurting United States. So the take-home message, to put it in a very ironic way, is that, so say for example, like if the finding of this paper is true, one implication is that we all know that US administrations have been encouraging and forcing China to improve property rights protection, intellectual property rights protection. And this is, indeed, China is doing better and better. I mean, like, in absolute terms, China is still doing worse than the United States. But the problem, the most important thing is the relative distance in the quality of institutions. And indeed, they are catching up, at least in the economic domain. So say, for example, like in this kind of like commercial arbitration institutions in China, I mean, like, they are basically saying that we want foreigners, we want foreign judges, we want foreign lawyers, right? I mean, this is something that's almost unimaginable in Chinese domestic courts, but this is a reform that's promoted by many local Chinese governments. And if this process continue, then the erosion of the institutional comparative advantage of the United States would also continue. So again, the implication is that probably I am too pessimistic, but the one implication we could draw from this paper is that, like, we might see more and more these kind of anti-globalization politicians in industrialized democracies, even though when China is improving its domestic institutions.
Yeah. Okay, then since no one else has a question, I have a bunch, but so we can have a conversation until someone chimes in. So I'll give you one more, and then we'll go to the other questions. The other question is, if it's true that under President Xi, the Chinese state has become more important in the international economy profile of China, the state-owned enterprises, wouldn't that suggest that these arbitration courts will become less important over time, because they're basically dealing between foreign and Chinese private companies for the most part, and maybe two Chinese private companies in China? As you said, 75% of their cases of the CIETAC are Chinese and Chinese complaints. To the degree that it's an international phenomenon that affects China's foreign policy, wouldn't the move towards more state-owned enterprise emphasis make the arbitration courts less important, because BITs would be more important because you're dealing with foreigners dealing with the state?
I think so. I definitely agree. If you look at the arbitral awards of CTAC and many other similar commercial arbitrations in the arbitration institutions in the world, actually a small proportion of them actually involve state-owned companies. Yeah, very few of them involve state-owned companies, because as long as state-owned company is involved, it usually trigger investor-state disputes. Yeah. I think you're absolutely correct, and that's also my impression in studying those those arbitration awards. So they are actually quite. I mean, like, that's why I keep emphasizing that they are only partially substituting for independent courts. This is because TCA, they certainly cannot handle disputes with state-owned companies, large state-owned companies. So that there are always still limits for these international institutions. So probably we do not have to be that pessimistic, because eventually there will still be institutional comparative advantage of the United States that could not be obtained by China. So if this is true, I think we could draw this implication.
Okay, can you see the questions?
I couldn't.
It should be in the chat function.
Yeah, I may have to return it.
There's one from Norgis Casanova.
And there's also one from Yeling Tan.
And then one from Yeling Tan, one of our former fellows. Your first interaction with the former fellows.
Yeah, it's a great honor to be talk to everyone here. Okay, so I see it. Yes. Can you comment on the, what are the implications of the and some realities? The system of creating better legal environment for Ph.D. with the help it puts a comparative advantage of the mass investment. Yes, yes, I do agree. So when Tom Ginsberg, who is now at Chicago Law School, he's basically saying that these institutions are actually kind of like these institutions are basically discriminating domestic investors. So they are more preferential. On one hand, they are more preferential to foreign investors. So this is what Tom Ginsberg, who's been studying this area. But on the other hand, as we could also see from the China case, actually these institutions, when they were first created, they were designed to resolve foreign related disputes. But later, they also hear disputes that involve no foreign companies or foreign individuals. So probably the institutional discrimination against domestic investors may not be a huge problem, at least in the case of CTEC. And the implications of this global trend, yeah, I totally agree. This is exactly one implication of my first paper. That is like authoritarian countries, they are very, very eager. They are very, very passionate in creating these commercial arbitration institutions and signing BITs. And doing so, they could credibly signal to foreign investors that, yes, please come. This is a market economy environment. Your assets will be well protected and you will be well respected. On the other hand, they will continue to use political courts, illiberal political courts to strengthen their authoritarian rule. So in the long run, is this kind of partial rule of law a good thing for rule of law? Let's wait and see, because this is like a kind of a pretty new phenomenon. So let's wait and see. But I do see that authoritarian leaders have such incentive to use liberal economic courts in combination with illiberal political courts to strengthen their rule. And the second question from Yeling Tan about the union erosion.
Can you read the question out loud, just so that
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I think I should talk about it. All right, so the second question is that, what about the decline of unions and erosion of the social safety net in the US that could have contributed to anti-globalization sentiments? Could you discuss if that might be an omitted variable in our analysis? Thanks. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we haven't explicitly controlled for that. We control for manufacturing and services, but we haven't controlled for the decline of the unions and social safety network. And this is something that we will certainly like to do in revising our paper. And thanks a lot for this suggestion. I think this is a very, yeah, we might possibly have an omitted variable bias here if we don't control for that. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I don't see further questions.
That was the last question in the chat.
Weiwen,
Yeah.
let me ask you another one, which is, do you find that in low contract area production that there is not the same kind of frustration about globalization? Which is similar to Yeling's question, but it's not focused on unions, but just if you have production in manufactured goods that are widely produced around the world already in 1998, wherever your start point is, and still are produced widely around the world and are widely available. In those counties, would you see the same level of frustration with globalization and support for either Trump or Bernie Sanders or some other protectionist candidate?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think this is a very good question as well. This part of anecdotal evidence is still missing in our paper, in the current version of the paper. So I think we need to look for that. Yeah, although the statistical evidence suggests that, yeah, this might be the case, counties that are still producing contract-intensive goods would have a lower level of anti-globalization sentiment. So this is our statistical finding, but in terms of anecdotal evidence, yeah, we haven't looked for this aspect of stories. So this is something that we would continue to do in revising the paper. And thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for all these questions. And they are certainly very helpful for us in revising this working paper. Thank you. Yeah, I'm taking note of that.
Any other questions from the audience?
And yeah, one thing I would like to add is that actually in economics, scholars have been studying these kind of production networks, contract intensity, but it is a pretty new concept in political science. And we believe that there's huge potential for this research agenda because it has a lot of theoretical and practical implications. And so this is basically what my theoretical work, and so the first paper study contract enforcement, and the second paper is also relevant to contract enforcement. And we believe that both of them, I mean, like contract enforcement is underappreciated. The importance of contract enforcement is understudied in political science in IPE, and we believe that there's a huge gap to be filled, and there's a lot that could be done in this area.
So I'll ask you another question that just pops to mind is that I know that there's a lot of very specific contractual relationships between Taiwan chip makers and Chinese electronic firms on the mainland, right?
Yeah, yes.
Mainland
yeah.
Chinese electronics firms, I should say.
Yeah.
And TSMC in Taiwan. How are they affected by the environment that you describe in terms of arbitration, or obviously there's not going to be a bit across the Taiwan Strait anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And then how are they affected by the U.S.-China trade war, and particularly the use of secondary sanctions by the United States on any company that uses U.S. technology to sell to firms like Huawei or ZTE?
Yeah. Thanks. This is a very good question. So these international institutions are actually sometimes used as a last resort. So a lot of them. So when two firms, or when the firm and the host government, they really have to resolve the disputes in either ICSID tribunals or TCA, in this kind of independent tribunals, it means that the negotiation actually failed. And so basically these institutions are always used as a last resort. One fun fact is that China has, as a host country, China has never been sued by a foreign firm. It doesn't mean that China is perfect in protecting foreign investors' assets. That's certainly not true. But it suggests that actually, before reaching to BIT, before reaching to these kind of independent tribunals, the government and the firm, they have already settled their disputes informally. And and this also applies to firm level disputes. I mean, like contractual disputes between foreign and domestic firms. So I would say for this very important investor in China, not only for TSMC, but also for many other big names, they don't really need to use BIT. But BIT is still useful for them as a last resort. That is right, when negotiation fail, when private mediation fail, eventually they could use these kind of formal institutions to protect.
Has a Taiwan firm ever used arbitration on the mainland?
Yes, commercial arbitration, yes, very frequently. Very frequently, yeah. But BIT, no. Because first of all, there's no BIT between.
No BIT.
Yeah. And China has never been sued in reference to BIT. So there are a lot of investor-state disputes in China, but China was never brought to ICSID tribunal. Not because China has a perfect record in doing it, but just because the Chinese government are more willing to negotiate a better deal before going. Actually, appearing in the court could cause a lot of losses. So there's already study that indicates that even getting sued at ICSID, not necessarily losing the case, could lose like tens of millions could cause a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in investments.
Yeah, there are other reasons though, Weiwen. I mean, I was involved in negotiations with China on BIT as a backbencher at the State Department, and you know, a lot of BITs that China has are very carefully crafted for the specific relationship with that country, so they're very unlikely to come to any kind of conflict. A really sweeping BIT like, you know, the United States has with Singapore, or the United States was trying to get with China, isn't really designed for specific disputes. It's more designed for opening up the market to investment. You get a much wider swath of the Chinese economy that is open to US investment. And there's an agreement to say you can't block an American firm from investing in, say, telecommunications because the BIT says you can't, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And your experience is also, I strongly agree with that. So if we look at early BITs signed by China, they are pretty low standard. Yeah, they still show that China is going to open the economy, but basically China is not delegating any dispute resolution to independent tribunals such as ICSID. But later and later, in particular after the 2000, in particular after 2010, the new BIT signed by China, they are pretty high standard. This is because China is becoming a capital exporter, and they want their interests to be protected by ICSID. So in those newer version of BITs, BITs, you could see that there are ICSID clauses. So you're absolutely correct. So the BITs signed by China are very different. This partly contributes to the fact that China has never been sued by.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I also learned quite a lot from what you just said. Yeah.
So if there are no more questions, we can probably wrap up. I thought there were two excellent talks. They were actually kind of one talk because they relate to each other. I think the papers have great promise. Is the first section of it published already?
Not yet. I'm still, but the first one is basically done. And I think I'm going to submit it to a good journal. And the second one is still we are still on the way of writing the full manuscript. So hopefully we could get it done by the end of this year, and we look forward to submitting them in good journals.
Oh, that's terrific. Yeah, congratulations. And it's great to have you on board. And thanks for being the pioneer and being the first fellow to present this year.
Thanks.
I'm sorry we can't all meet in person. It's always much more fun.
Yeah.
And we get good Chinese food when we meet in person. But you know, when you come back for the alumni events, we'll all be in person. And I'm still hoping that in the spring we'll be able to have a workshop in person. But that's with both hands, with fingers crossed. But that's in April. So a lot of good things have to happen between now and April for us to meet in person. But maybe it will happen, and we'll all get together in Indiana as well. So
yeah, I can't wait to. I mean, I very much look forward to it, and I can't wait to seeing all of you in person. I think this would be very fun, and I could certainly learn quite a lot from you. And indeed, I have already learned quite a lot from you and from the audience today. And there are a lot of very useful feedbacks for us to revise the paper. So yeah, this is a great opportunity, and thanks for giving me this opportunity and hosting me here.
Thank you, Weiwen.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, thanks for your work.